There's a great old story about an elderly black man who is reading scripture at a rally, a protest that his local church is hosting. The pastor has asked this elderly black man if he would be willing to read the parable of the persistent widow at this protest against injustice. And so this elderly black man comes up to the pulpit and he reads the parable that I just shared with you, the parable of the persistent widow, the unjust judge. He told the people what Jesus told his disciples of our need to pray without ceasing. Pray always and do not lose heart. And when he finished the reading, he closed the Bible and he offered the people a very simple one-sentence sermon. He said, unless you have stood year after year knocking on the locked door of justice, knuckles bleeding, you don't know what prayer is. Well, take a look at the woman in Jesus' parable. Take a close look at the woman in Jesus' parable of the persistent widow and the unjust judge. Don't look into her eyes. Don't look at the back of her head. Take a close look at the back of her hands. I suspect you will see some knuckles bloodied in the knocking for justice in her life. Jesus says this is a woman of great strength, of great faith, dare I say it, of stamina. A woman who keeps going even when access to justice is locked before her. A woman who keeps pounding day after day, week after week, going to an unjust judge, demanding justice in her life, her knuckles bleeding from her ministry, from her faithful pursuit of justice. You can just imagine the challenges she had. Jesus doesn't say what the injustice was in her life. He just says she was fighting for justice. In my imagination, I somehow picture this woman who is a widow, whose children have perhaps abandoned her, her adult children who have turned her out, her adult children who are breaking one of the 10 commandments, honor thy father and thy mother. Maybe without dad around anymore, the kids have taken the property, they've taken the cash, and they no longer honor the mother. Jesus doesn't say. But we do know that she was a widow, and we do know that in the time of Jesus, widows didn't have any rights. They had no status in the world apart from their family, no power, no privilege, certainly very little access to legal counsel or access to a judge, whether it was a good one or an unjust judge. And Jesus says, yet she persists. She goes and she pounds on that door, the door of the judge who perhaps is hiding out in his chambers, the judge who's crooked, says Jesus, who perhaps has told his receptionist, tell her to go away. I'm not here. Tell her I'm out of town. Tell her I'm away on business. Tell her anything but make her go away. But does she go away? No, this is a persistent widow. She keeps coming. She keeps coming until she gets a spot on that judge's calendar, a time on his schedule to come before him and plead her case. And does she win at first? No, she does not. The judge turns her away, sends her away, says, be gone, you lose. But she goes home. She goes home and she refines her case. She refines her arguments and tightens things up a bit. So 20 or 30 minutes is turned into 5 or 4 minutes. And so maybe that crooked judge will give her another opportunity. And she goes once again and she pounds on that door and she says, you will hear my case. And the judge turns her away again, and she goes away, and she comes back. She keeps coming back and coming back until finally that crooked judge says to himself, "Oh, my Lord, I need to give this woman what she asks for." This judge, who neither feared God or respected people, finally gave in. He crumbled under the weight of her persistence. He gave her what she wanted. He said, "I need to give her justice, because if I don't, she's going to just keep coming. And if she keeps coming, in the end," some translation says, "she's going to slap me in the face. She's going to punch me in the nose," if you want to do the literal translation on this. This woman is persistent in her faith. She will not back down until she gets justice. Oh, we've known this woman, haven't we? Not just from 2,000 years ago, from reading the passage in Sunday school when we were children. We know her because the headlines talk about her all the time, don't they? We know this woman. This is the woman who's been assaulted. And she wants the perpetrator to be charged. This is the woman who will take a perpetrator to court even when people start to blame her, the victim. This is the woman who the jury of the public wants to shut her down and say, "Well, look what she was wearing. She was wearing this and she was wearing that. Did you see how short that skirt was? And what was she doing there in the first place?" Somehow placing blame on the victim and not the perpetrator. Why? Because they like the perpetrator. He's a nice guy. He's one of our favorite teachers. They like the perpetrator. It's a coach for the Olympic team. It's one of our favorite entertainers, America's Mr. Funny Man. So they side with the perpetrator. But does she back down? The woman who's been assaulted? No. She keeps coming and coming until she gets justice, even against the pushback from the court of public opinion, even against the media that wants to slander her and trash talk her, even against her friends and family who wish she'd just be quiet, settle down, move on. No, we've known this woman, haven't we? We've known her here in the 21st century. We see her talked about in the headlines all the time. She's the woman whose son was shot in that bad neighborhood. And she can't seem to get a fair trial because the ones who committed the crime, well, they know all the crooked lawyers and they know all the crooked judges. And they know the sentiment and the heart of those with leverage and those with power and ability to affect change in those bad neighborhoods. But they're not there. They're somewhere else sipping wine and consoling each other's fears with slogans and cliches like, "We don't have to be troubled by it. It's just black on black crime." But she doesn't back down, does she? She keeps coming. She keeps coming until she gets justice. Oh, the court of public opinion says she's just after the money. And they say, "Oh, her lawyers just showed up because they're after the money." But you know what? Every mother in this room knows it's not about the money, it's about justice. And so she pounds at the door until her knuckles bleed. Yes, we know this woman, don't we? We know this woman. Jesus says we have to have faith like that. We have to have this persistent faith that will not relent in the face of crooked judges and crooked lawyers, that will not give up until justice is ours. Jesus says that's the way we need to pray. Pray always and do not lose heart. He lifts up this woman as an example for us to follow. This one who's been beaten down and maligned in the court of public opinion, beaten down and maligned by crooked judges and a crooked legal system. He lifts her up. So I have a question for you. I have a question for you today. Do you have that kind of faith? Do you have that kind of faith to keep going even when the court of public opinion is knocking you down? Do you have that kind of faith to keep going even when people are pushing back? Do you have that kind of faith to keep going when you spotted justice but everybody else around wants you to be quiet? Jesus says that's the kind of faith you need to have, because Every one of us in this room is confronted with injustice at one time or another. Every one of us in this room knows what it's like to be that widow at one time or another, fighting against the locked doors of the injustice of illness and cancer, knocking at the locked doors of injustice, the injustice of a bad economy, a time of unemployment, the loss of a job, whether we deserve to lose that job or not. Every one of us have been there. Every one of us knows what it is to face trials in this world, to face challenges in this sullied world, in these dark times in which we live. Jesus says you need to have that kind of faith if you're going to call yourself one of my disciples. You would not believe how many people say to me, as soon as they find out that I'm a pastor or I'm a Christian, maybe you get it too. You tell somebody that you're a Christian, I'm a disciple of Jesus, I follow Jesus Christ, and people will say to me, Pastor, you know, you don't have to go to church on Sundays to be a Christian. People will say to me, Pastor, all you have to do is believe in Jesus to be a Christian. And I want to say, really, so how many years have you spent reading that Bible? Really, how many years did you spend in seminary studying the Word of God? But you're telling me, the pastor, that you don't have to go to church to be a Christian. All you have to do is say, I believe, and you're a Christian. Well, you know what? Jesus says, not so fast. In fact, for Jesus, being a Christian is about what we do after we say, I believe. For Jesus, being a Christian is a lifetime pursuit. It's praying always. Or in the words of the epistles, it's to pray without ceasing. As a matter of fact, to be a Christian does mean to show up in worship week after week, listening to a sermon even when it may seem long and the hymns may seem dull. Or vice versa, when the sermon seems dull and the hymns seem long. That's what it is to be a Christian. For Jesus, to be a disciple is a practice. It is a discipline. That's why we have the word disciple. How many people will say, man, I prayed to God, it didn't work, so I don't believe in God. Well, how many times did you pray? Oh, I was a Christian for a whole year. Attaboy. Not until we have stood year after year knocking on the locked doors of justice, knuckles bleeding, do we know what it is to pray. Jesus says, to be a Christian, to be one of my followers, a disciple of Jesus, it is very much about our practice of faith. It is very much about going to worship week after week, that God's word might sustain you during the hard times, might fortify you, that you might continue praying even when you don't feel like praying. It's about whispering your nighttime prayers night after night, week after week, year after year, even if those prayers have to begin with the words, Lord, are you really there? And then keep praying. And if the Lord doesn't say anything in return, you keep praying. And if you don't get the answer you wanted, you keep praying. If you get the answer you didn't want, you keep praying. Pray always, says Jesus, and do not lose heart. That's what it is to be one of my disciples. Even when God seems silent or God feels absent from our lives, you keep going. You keep praying. Now, many of you here in this room, I know, are familiar with the very famous Jewish activist, Holocaust survivor, Elie Wiesel, who passed away just this past July. Elie Wiesel, when he was 15 years of age, was arrested by the Nazi regime. He was imprisoned first in Buchenwald, then Auschwitz. He lost his entire family. You do know that 90% of the people who showed up at Auschwitz were killed as they arrived. 90%. You got off that train, shoved out of those boxcars, you were killed immediately. 90%. Wiesel lost his entire family until the Russian liberation of Auschwitz in January of 1945, until the American liberation of Buchenwald in April of 1945. He lost them all. When most kids, 15, 16, 17 years of age, spend their days asking to borrow the car that they might take a girl out on a date, who spend their lives studying as hard as they can because they have the promise of a future, of going off to college, dreaming about what tomorrow might hold, what joys and blessings might be theirs. Wiesel spent those years in concentration camps, grieving the loss of his entire family, grieving the loss of his friends, his community, grieving the loss of his fellow brothers and sisters in the Jewish faith. In one of his books, Wiesel writes about a particular day when people are so despairing, so angry at the absence of God, the ineffectiveness of God in this dire situation, that they put God on trial. They hold a mock trial. God is the accused. God is accused of having ability to change this situation, but doing nothing. And guess what? At the end of the trial, they find God guilty. Guilty of doing nothing, even though God could do something. And someone asked Wiesel, well, what did you do after you found God guilty? He said, what did we do? We went back and we did the evening prayer. We continued to pray. Because even though we as humans found God guilty, we know that our hope was in God and only God. And we believe that God was still doing something in the world, no matter how dire it was for us personally, that God was doing something in this world and that justice would finally come. Jesus said, if you call yourself a Christian, you need to pray always and never, ever lose heart. We're called to keep knocking on that door, knuckles bleeding, until finally it opens a crack and the light of justice begins to shine into our hearts, into our minds, into our world, and into our lives. Keep knocking. That's what it is to be a Christian. Now I want to share with you some very, very good news, fellow disciples of Jesus. The very, very good news is this, that when we knock on those locked doors, we don't knock alone. We are not alone in our knocking, in our crying, in our demanding for justice in this world. Jesus himself knocks on that door with us. Jesus himself pounds on that door with us. Jesus said, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If you let me in, I will come into your life and I will dine with you and you will dine with me. Behold, I stand at the door and knock, and if you let me in, I will come in and I will sustain you in your work for justice. I will empower you so that you might keep going the distance. We're just a little off track if we think we've got to go it alone. The promise of the gospel is that Jesus goes with us. Jesus knocks with us and for us. His Spirit comes into us and sustains us. Jesus allows us to go with one another and support each other and knock as one people, his church in this world, until justice finally opens its door for us. You know, a few years ago, I told you about my friend Pam Tomei. Pam was a social worker in South Africa who became a pastor, eventually moved to Canada, and that's where I met her. She was a pastor of the United Church of Canada. But she told me about her faith journey, how she became a Christian, and then how she became a pastor. She said, one day as a new social worker, they had sent me in to one of the black neighborhoods in South Africa. It was during apartheid, one of the darkest periods of South African history. And I use the term neighborhood loosely, but what it was a shanty town where the poorest of poor lived, and the government threw them a bone every now and then, a social worker who went in kind of like a public health nurse to check on the health of families and families who had new children, etc. That was Pam. She went into this neighborhood. And she said, I was visiting this one family on this particular day in their home. And their home was a clapboard, single-room building with a tin roof, mud floor. She said, what I saw was a single mother. Maybe the husband was there. He was off working. Who knows? But it was just a mom there by herself, raising a whole bunch of kids who even in extreme poverty found a way to be happy and were playful and joyful. But she said, I noticed over in the corner of the room, laying on a blanket, was this listless child, an infant. It was not crying. It was not fussing. It didn't have the strength to do either of those things. And yet it was awake. She said, obviously the child was not well. And so I asked the mother, what's wrong with your baby? And she said, my baby's sick. She said, have you taken your child to the hospital? And she said, no, the nearest hospital, the only hospital I can get to is for whites only. And Pam said, let's take your baby. We're going to the hospital today. They got in Pam's government car, the mother of this child, and Pam drove. And they got to the hospital, and Pam said, let me carry your baby. And she picked up that child and walked into that whites-only hospital with this black child and her mother. She said you could have seen the jaws on everyone in that reception room drop when she came into that room. They knew, you're not supposed to be here. And Pam went to the admitting nurse and she said, we need to see a doctor today. And the admitting nurse said, the doctor won't see you. You're the wrong color. And Pam said, the doctor bloody will see us today. And apparently the admitting nurse either knew Pam was a woman of persistence, that she meant business, or the admitting nurse knew the truth as well, that every child deserves some care, whether you're white, you're black, or any other color. And she went and got that doctor, and the doctor came out. Thankfully, the doctor was one of the good ones who cared for this child, nursed that child back to health, and as far as I know, that child grew up, is healthy, and is living in an apartheid-free South Africa today. I said to Pam, so what was it about that experience that made you become a Christian? And she said, well, Mark, it was when I picked that child up. I said, what do you mean? She said, when I held that child, at that very moment, I knew that I was touching injustice. At that very moment, I knew that I was touching injustice, and I knew the truth. I knew the truth that this child deserved life and life abundant in Jesus, and there was no way I could do anything but take this child to a doctor. I said, Pam, that child is so lucky that you came into its life. You saved that child's life. She said, Mark, I am blessed that God sent that child into my life. You see, that child saved me. It was at that very moment that Pam knew the truth. She knew that she was being called as a Christian now into the work of justice, the knocking on the doors until knuckles bled. She eventually became a pastor and took up the mantle full time. Folks, Jesus knocks with us. Jesus sends people into our lives. A social worker in apartheid South Africa, a sickly child whose mere illness and our touching it transforms our hearts, transforms our minds, and sets us into the world as a disciple of Jesus, a door-knocking Christian demanding justice in a very sullied world in these very darkened times. Jesus sends his Spirit into our hearts, into our lives, into us as the body of Jesus Christ, that we might knock on those doors together. Folks, when you leave here today, I want you to look at one another. This is This might be a challenge, but I want you to be able to recognize the Christ not only in yourself, but to recognize it in one another. To see that Christ has come to you, come to us all as his people here in the heart of Greater Cleveland. I want you to recognize the Christ in each other. If you can do that, if you can see the Christ that has come to you, I want you to celebrate one another, to give thanks to God that you don't knock alone in this world. And when you see one another, I want you to see the people of God. I want you to see God's church. This is what God is doing in my life. This is what God is doing in this world. This world that's so often filled with lies and deceit and brokenness and crooked and unjust judges and crooked and unjust lawyers, a crooked and broken legal system. I want you to know that the body of Christ is alive and well. It's living in all of you. And for almost 200 years, this church has been the hands and the feet of Jesus Christ, stomping its foot down, demanding justice for so many throughout the history of this great city, knocking on the doors until they budge open, and justice comes flooding out, flowing like a great river onto the people of God and onto this world. Friends, we do not knock alone. The risen Christ has come. The risen Christ says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If you let me in, I will come in and dine with you, and you with me. I will sustain you, O people of God." Praise be to God. Amen.